Hey, we're in Psalm 40 this morning, so if you have a Bible, and why wouldn't you? You're in church. We just want to look at two verses that I want to leave you with a thought. You know, sometimes Sunday mornings is a good way to just kind of leave one impression, and hopefully it'll stay with you this week and leave an impact upon your heart. I don't know if you know about how the Old Testament is laid out, but it is basically in three different categories. There are the historical books at the beginning. They start in the book of Genesis, run through the book of Esther. There are the prophetic books at the back of your Old Testament, beginning at the book of Isaiah and ending with the last book in the book of Malachi, or Malachi, or whatever you pronounce that. And then there are those books in the middle. We call them the poetic books. If you've read them, or if you're young and have attempted to read them, they are written in a completely different way because they are Hebrew prose. Hebrew poetry has much more, has a greater ability to communicate feelings and understandings than English does, or for that matter, mostly Greek without, Hebrew without the prose. Starts in the book of Job. It runs through the Song of Solomon, but they're unique for a couple of reasons. Not just that they are poetic, but they are written in the present tense. So that if you outline the Bible in a large way, the historical books cover the past, the prophetic books cover the future, but in the middle is this poetic section that covers the present, and it is all written in the first person. So there's no narrative, and as you find in the historical books, where you're told a story and you're learning by placing yourself in the story. There really is no prophetic utterances, although some of them are prophetic. But the poetic books are written so that you and I might examine our present tense relationship with the Lord. In fact, the presumption is made in these books that you're interested in your relationship with God being current and being strong. Especially when you get to the book of Psalms, it is sometimes like eavesdropping on someone's prayers. You find David and the other writers writing in despair, wondering where God is, asking God why, sometimes challenging his decisions, other times, wrestling within themselves to trust him. It is a great place to learn your perspective of the character of God, the joy of the Lord, the need that you have for him in your life. But they're all present tense. It is the day-to-day walk with God that God is interested in exploring there. So I guess we could have picked any psalm. I picked this one because I think there's a thought here that I like, and maybe you haven't considered it. If you have, maybe I want to kind of get you to think about it again. But we're going to look at two verses, verse 5 and verse 17. Here's what verse 5 says. It says, "Many, O Lord my God, are your wondrous or wonderful works which you have done, and your thoughts towards us cannot be recounted to you in order. If I would declare and speak of them, they are more than could be numbered." The last verse in this Psalm of David says this, "I am poor and I am needy, and yet the Lord thinks upon me. You are my help and my deliverer, so do not delay, O my God." Let me get you to think for a couple of minutes about the way that the Lord's thoughts are towards you. How many of you are busy? See, the first service, these guys are slackers, I think, because none of them, only two hands went up. No, I'm just playing. We're busy, right? We're busy people. I've always thought, and the older I get, I always say to my wife, we got to slow down. And we always say, we will, next year. And then somehow before we get to the next year, that calendar fills up, and we're no slower than we've ever been. We seem to be in a constant state of busyness, and I think that probably is true for all of us. But I've noticed something. The busier you are, the more forgetful you become. Does that make sense? We run out of the house. I do a lot of speaking. We have a large church. I don't like to be out of the pulpit, to be honest with you. So we do a lot of, from Wednesday to Saturdays, we'll fly and travel and then come back for Sunday. But invariably, if you're busy, you begin to forget. Like there was one time we just went away for the night, but we forgot to put the dog outside. And the dog was not at all happy about that at all, Or you forget to turn the heater off or the air conditioner if you could. You forget to pick something up at the grocery store. There's just a way to forget. A couple of months ago, we forgot we had a dinner date with friends. That wasn't a way to keep friends at all. We got a call. Fortunately, it was close enough where we could, oh yeah, we're just running late, like really late, like we would have never showed up. Or you forget a birthday. Or God forbid you should forget your 39th anniversary, which I suspect none of you have done. You're still here and you're not in a wheelchair, so I think you haven't been. I can't imagine you could survive that. It is hard to be busy and be mindful. As a kid, maybe 4th or 5th grade, my parents or my mother used to pick us up from school. She forgot one day. She got busy with her friends, and we sat on the stoop from like 2:30 to 4:30. No cell phones there, no internet to call her. Maybe she died, we didn't know. But she was just busy. I'm also convinced that the older you get, the larger that folder that says, I don't remember, becomes. I forever am saying to my wife, what's that guy's name again? Where would we eat it the other day? Well, you know the one. And she looks at me like, don't ask me that publicly. I'm just as much in the dark as you are. But I still ask her publicly so we can blame someone. So, sometimes it's good to not remember. I think, at least for me, getting older, the things that used to bother me don't so much. I tend to just go, I don't care. And I mean it, I don't care. They were crises when I was 25, but at 65, I don't care. Sometimes that works in my favor, like I owe you money and I forget. No guilt and debt-free all at the same time. It doesn't really matter, though, how old you are. I think busyness and all, we all experience forgetfulness, whether it's being preoccupied or whether it's just getting older. We're going to drop the ball, which I think, if you grab hold of that experiential truth, then you find yourself being more amazed at the fact that we read here that God thinks about you all the time. That blows my mind, that he would think about you all the time. It seems to be an extremely encouraging thought. I wrote in my Bible over those 2 verses, Willie Nelson. That's the way I write my notes in my Bible, because he has a song that says what? You're always on. You've never heard that here? Okay, come on, help me here. It is hard for me to comprehend the idea that God is always thinking about me. How about you? I trust that there are people who love me, and because they do, I come into their minds now and again. I suspect that people that don't like me very much think about me more often, and not maybe with the same kind of hopefulness. I can understand and I can believe in the sense of understanding the character of God, that because God is who he is, that his love for me is unconditional. I've had to look at that time and again in my Christian life over these last many years. And I even think that God sometimes would throw a thought my way, like my picture is that God thinks about me more when I'm messing up. He thinks about me shaking his head and sighing and maybe muttering under his breath, I knew that he was going to do that. That's the way I relate in my understanding of who God is. But these 2 verses would suggest an entirely different concept, that I should see God in a way that would really just revolutionize my understanding of his love and the way that I behave towards him, because these verses and a few others would say to us that there isn't ever a time in your life that he's not thinking about you. With all that he's going through, with all that he's responsible for, with everything that depends upon him, you're not like 11th on the list or on page 5 somewhere in a footnote. You're first. You're first. He thinks about you every moment of every day. And that there is never a time when you're out of his mind, you're out of his field of vision, you're removed from his concern. There is a willful thought, and you're always in it. Doesn't that blow your mind? And that's the present tense that God sets before us in this Psalm of David's. Notice he says here in verse 5, And I think David was aware of the fact, with all of the wonderful things which you've done, and the word done is a present perfect tense verb, which probably means nothing to you, but in Hebrew it means it's something that's been done in the past, continues to be done in the future, and is being done in the present. It's an ongoing action. In other words, God is so busy doing all of these wonderful things, he's still got time to think about you. I remember saying to my father a couple of times, "Hey, you want to come out?" "I'm busy," he'd say. "I'm busy." I get it. I use that with my kids. I'm busy. It works perfectly. But God isn't busy, not too busy for you. Unbelievable. Just blows my mind. He has a busy schedule. I mean, you can make a list of everything from the Bible that God says he's responsible for. Look at the creation, and just, I think the whole idea of creation or universe maintenance should tell you he's juggling. Psalm 95. His hands are upon the deep places of the earth. The hills belong to him. The heavens are his, and he made them. His hand formed the dry land. Nehemiah stands up in chapter 9 and speaking to the people and encouraging them, says, "Lord, you're God," in his prayer. "Everything has been made by you. You preserve them all." The word literally means to keep them going. God's responsible for the universe. And it isn't some abstract kind of relationship where he makes them, spins them, and walks away. The implication is he's actively involved with them every minute of every day. He's busy. He's extremely busy. Job heard from the Lord, "Job, stand still. Consider the wonderful works of God." Look what God's doing, Job. And then the Lord begins to lay out from the kind of things that he was running as he starts there in chapter 38. We are told in chapter 12, I think it is as well, of Job, that in his hand is the life of every man and their breath. God's busy, what? Keeping you breathing. What if he's going, "I'll be right back. I got to just run an errand," and you're done. Well, what would happen then? But that doesn't happen. For every human being on the planet, for every animal that roams the earth, for every fish that swims in the sea, and every bird that flies through the air, the Lord's busy keeping it all moving. With all of the wonderful things that you have done, your thoughts towards me cannot be recounted to you in order. If I were to declare and speak of them, they are more than could be numbered. Amazing, isn't it? It's amazing. And I think David had a sense of that when he wrote in Psalm, I think it's, what Psalm would it be? Psalm 8? I guess it's Psalm 8. Where he said, "When I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, and the stars which you have made, who is man that you would be mindful of him? Or the Son of Man that you would visit him?" In other words, look at all that God has done and how great these works are, and yet somehow in all of that busyness, he is still interested in us, to watch over us. When Job was put in his place, and you might remember that Job was pretty upset with God, asked a lot of questions, was really, almost on the point of being arrogant, but not to the point of sin. God didn't rebuke him for those things. But in chapter 38, the Lord begins by questioning Job with lots of questions that really have no answers other than, "I wasn't there, I don't know." And the answer from God was, "Well, I was there and I do know." In other words, I'm God, you're not, so maybe we should start with that. But as he begins there in the middle of chapter 38, and it's in the middle of those questions, the Lord asks Job, "Do you know about the cluster of the Pleiades, the star cluster? Or can you loosen the belt of Orion? Or can you move Mazzaroth in his season? All stars, all have constellations. Can you guide the great bear with its cubs? Do you know the ordinances of heaven? Do you know about the dominions of the earth? Can you say to the lightning, strike there but not there? Can you gather the clouds together and tell them to gather the abundance of water? Can you pour out the bottles of heaven? Can you say and satisfy the appetite of the young lions? And Job is like, no, I can't do it. And the Lord said, that's what I do. How great and wonderful are your works, Lord, and yet you think about me. He's busy feeding lions, moving stars around, commanding the skies, and moving the lightning. He's a busy God. And yet, with all that he has to oversee, he's not too busy for you. And right now, he's thinking about you. Now, you've got an advantage right now. You're in church. You're probably thinking about him. We'll see how you do at 2 o'clock this afternoon or 5 o'clock in the morning, because he doesn't stop. There was a news article about 18 months ago of a near collision between Earth and an asteroid. The asteroid was a half a mile wide. It was traveling at 50,000 miles an hour. It missed us by 500,000 miles. 10 hours worth of space. They predicted that had it hit the Earth, it might very well have knocked the Earth off of its axis. That doesn't sound good. Here's what was worse. They made the announcement a day after it had gone by us. That was worse. In other words, they didn't know it was coming. Now NASA has a satellite. It's called the NEOWISE. It stands for Near Earth Object Wide Field Infrared Survey Explorer. It missed the stupid thing. What do I care what the thing's called? I'm far more, it's got a fancy title and spends lots of money. I'm far more comforted by the fact that God's watching out for me and for you. With all that he is busy with everything that can fill his thoughts, you are at the top of the list. That to me is unbelievable and yet absolutely true. Hard to comprehend, but something that we need to grasp. And notice that David in verse 5 makes that comparison. With all that you've done, with all that you're doing, with the catalog of all of your responsibility, running the universe, providing breath for every man, feeding every plant. You remember that the Lord there in the Sermon on the Mount said to the boys, have you considered the lilies of the field and how they grow and how they don't have to spin or to toil? And yet Solomon, in all of his glory, wasn't arrayed as some of these. He took credit for the plants. He talked to them about the sparrows, and he said, not one of them dies, but I don't know about it. You're much more important than they are. In all of that busyness, and we can understand busyness. Now, you can write that off and go, well, God, he can do anything. All right, maybe that's true. In fact, I know that's true. But that doesn't minimize the fact that in his decision-making process, he puts you at the top of the list. He could have put you on page 11. He didn't. Nor does he want to. I was watching some flies yesterday sitting out in the afternoon sun, and there seemed to be a lot of flies around. And I remember just thinking about what I was going to talk about this morning. I said to the Lord, why didn't you just wipe these things out? I mean, you had a choice. I get about the whole food and thing, but really, flies? I vote to leave them out. My son is a professional bass fisherman. Well, he has a job, and he does this in the weekends and weeks at a time in Southern California. They pay him. So when I was younger, he wanted me to buy a boat, and I get extremely seasick. I'm not a boat guy. Oh, I like them, but they don't like me. So I bought a boat. I figured if I had the key, we could just go out, and if I didn't feel good, we could move. Because when you get to moving, you don't feel so bad. And then I realized the only thing that you can't do when you're fishing is keep moving. That's called boating, not fishing. But we would go out 10, 12 miles off the coast towards Catalina where we live and survive. I called it surviving. He called it a lot of fun. But then when we were getting ready to come home, we'd empty the bait tank off the boat. And something interesting happened. From out of nowhere, these seagulls would come. Hundreds of them, 12 miles out to sea. We hadn't seen them all day. It's like the Lord went, food is served. And here they came. I always wondered, where did they get that information? Then the minute they ate, they disappeared. And you look around all the way back into shore, you didn't see any. God feeds them all. I love the picture that God was thinking about them. We have, at home, we had these white ash flies. I don't know if you know what those look like, but they're teeny little flies, and they get on bushes, and they're just thick. You grab them and shake them. They're like minuscule. They sell a product at home that's $90-some a gallon. That's ridiculous, right? But it kills these things. So we buy it. We mix it, we spray it, and they're gone. And then they come back. And I said to the Lord, really? Could you do something about these? And yet he runs these little flies' lives. I'm amazed at how God does what he does. I read on National Geographic 2 months ago, I think, of a new species of fish that they had not cataloged before that existed about 16,000 feet underwater, 3 miles down. And I thought to myself, why? Clean up the deal, man. Kill everything under like 200 feet. Who's going to see it anyway? And the Lord's just busy taking care of things. With all of your wonderful works, God made them, the luminescent, the exotic shapes, the awesome things that he does. I began to think through this whole idea of God's thinking about me, and I got to Psalm 121, I think it's verse 4, that says God doesn't ever slumber or sleep. And I thought, well, he doesn't have time for that. He's busy caring about everything that he made. But the comparison was, he still thinks upon me. And notice in verse 17 that David, he adds to the wonderment by saying, I'm poor and needy, which would say to me, I have very little to bargain with or to attract God's attention to me. I really don't have much to offer him. He has plenty to offer me. But though I am poor and needy, he thinks about me all the time. Look, this morning you're on God's mind. Before you got here, you were on his mind. Constantly. He wants to bless you. He would like to reward you. He wants to guide you. If you are an unbeliever, he wants to save you, to call you, to win you, to beckon you to himself, to woo you. He wants you. He's come to save you. You feel God's thoughts. It isn't just once in a while. He never forgets. In terms of creation, we're kind of insignificant, aren't we? Who is man that you are mindful of him? We're these little specks of dust amongst now getting towards 8 billion specks of dust living on one planet, rotating around the sun, one star, and the billions found in the Milky Way, one galaxy, and the millions that exist. Isaiah, in writing and speaking for the Lord, wrote, have you not understood from the foundations of the earth that it is he who sits above the circle of the earth? Its inhabitants to him are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heaven like a curtain. He spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. He brings princes to nothing, makes the judges of the earth useless. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely are they sown, scarcely do they stalk and find themselves in the earth, then they wither and to die. To whom will you liken me, or to whom will I be equal, he says. The one who created these things, who brings them out by host, who calls them by name, by the greatness of his strength and might and power, not one of them is missing. God's big, and you're a part of his life. It's an amazing thought to me. Stars whizzing by, planets spinning around, asteroids ready to kill us, fish at 3 miles deep, little creepy white ash flies on my plants. And God thinks about me. And he thinks about you. Now, we're not told, notice he said here in verse 5, that his thoughts towards us, David says, cannot be counted in order. In other words, I don't even know how to put a number on that because it's so many. Later on, you will read in Psalm 139, verse 17 and 18, how precious are your thoughts towards me, O Lord. How great is the sum of them. If I could count them, they would be more than the grains of the sands for multitude. Now, scientists today have a number for the grains of sand on our planet. I can't vouch for it, but they literally have done research and said that there is literally, from their perspective, as many grains of sand on our planet as there are stars in the heavens. And the number that they came up with was 10 to the 25th power. Is that right? I don't know. Let's just assume that's right. There's more than I can count. But that's a 10 followed by 25 zeros. That's a big number. If you live to be 70 years old, which the Bible says is the average age of life, in fact, last year the average age of life on the planet was 70.2 years. Some places far less, some places far greater, but that was the average. If you lived 70 years, you would live a total of 10 to the 9th power seconds, which, just rounding off the numbers, would say that God thinks about you, at least the first 70 years of your life, 3 times a second. That seems like overkill, doesn't it? In other words, there is never a split second where you drop off the list, where you aren't in first place. 10 to the 25th power of sand grains, 10 to the 9th power of your life. I can conclude, I think, with certainty that there's never a time that God doesn't think about me. I am always on his mind. Thank you, Willie Nelson. I am always on his mind. And I must tell you, I don't think that I'm on his mind simply as a maintenance checklist. How's Jack doing? Check. Breathing still? Good. Move on to the next person. That's not at all what this says. This tells me that God thinks about me because he loves me. Because I'll tell you what, when you love someone, you think about them. Don't you? You love your pastor. He's been gone for a few weeks, visiting his family. Doesn't get to do that very often. Pastors don't get away very often. Cut him some slack. He needs that in his life. He'll be all the better for it. So will you. But when you love people, you don't want them gone. My wife goes to women's retreats. I hate when she goes. I hate it. That means pizza for me for 3 days. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Look what it's done to me. I blame retreats. We don't have boys' night out, girls' night out at our house. I like hanging out with my wife. We don't get to do that enough. When people from church, a guy will go, hey, you want to go with me to the Dodger game? Want to go with me to the hockey? I go because you should be kind to people that want to be nice to you, but I'd rather just go with my wife. I'd like to say to them, could you just give me your ticket? I'll take my wife. But I'll go, and then I'll write to her. Hey, how are you? Miss you, love you. I was a wuss, man. This is how I am. God thinks about us in loving terms. He can't wait to one day be with you. You know, you're praying, Lord, come quickly. Don't think that he doesn't want to come quickly. But he wants to wait till that fruit comes in. But he suffers his separation as much as you do. Now, Satan would like to just do the opposite. He would like to convince you that God thinks about you only when some discipline is in order or required, or even worse, he doesn't think about you at all. And that's a lie. That's a lie. You remember that scripture in Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, right? I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of good, not of evil, to give you a hope, future. God's thoughts are for good. And that was a message delivered by the prophet at a time when Israel was about to go into Babylon's captivity for 7 years because they hadn't been interested in doing what the Lord wanted. He'd been warning them for generations. But God still had a good plan. His thoughts are always on your side, for you, to bless you, to use you. What should that do for you? Well, I hope that if you can wrap your head around the fact that God's always thinking about you, that would bring great comfort to your life. You know, whether there's danger or there's distress, fear, sometimes you feel lonely. Suffering tends to isolate. Makes you feel like you're the only one going through it. But to know that not only does God know, that's one thing, but he's presently involved, that's another. That I'm on his mind would assure me that I'm not alone, and he's going to take care of what I'm going through. And I think that if I know that to be so, it'll give me great comfort, because the enemy can be intimidating. So can life. We can be challenged by a lot of things, but if I know that the Lord is with me through all of this, if you know that he's going to see me through, and maybe most of all, I think knowing that he's thinking about me convinces me more than ever that he loves me. I should think about him more often, because he's always thinking about you. How often do you think about him? I think it was the Korah, the worship leader in Psalm 48 that said, Lord, I've been thinking about you and your loving kindness while I've been here in the midst of the temple. Maybe this week you can think about the Lord a little bit more often and remind yourself of 2 verses. Not so hard to remember 2 verses. Not very theologically deep here. God just loves you, and you're always on his mind. Isn't that wonderful? Sometimes I meet people I want to forget right away. God is just the opposite. You're always on his mind. The question is he always on yours? Father, thanks this morning that you give to us here, especially in these poetic books, these simple but very practical and present tense truths to grab a hold of, where our relationship with you might be enhanced and strengthened, where our understanding of your relationship with us might be widened and deepened as we think about just this one little thing, that we are always on your mind. You don't forget us. You haven't found yourself so busy that we've been allotted a secondary spot in your agenda, in your priority list. Lord, it is amazing to think that all of us collectively could be your favorite, but that's exactly what we read. That we're chosen by you and loved by you. We're the apple of your eye. You haven't lost sight of us. In fact, for everything that goes on around us, it is us that is your prized possession. We are told are your inheritance among the saints. We're what you're waiting for to gather together because of your Son. And may I encourage you this morning that you allow yourself to be thrilled by the thought of God thinking about you. You may think of yourself, gosh, I'm not much to think of. Well, that's what David said. I'm poor and needy, and yet the Lord. And maybe today you're here and you're not a Christian. Maybe you've been invited by someone, or in your desperation you hunted down a church. Or maybe someone who's been sharing with you and you've been considering. Look, our Bible would say that God thinks about you with only one intention. He wants a relationship with you. He sent his Son so that he could remove what separates you from God, your sin. It would be good if you could clean up your act and then present yourself, but that wasn't possible, isn't possible. Sin is stronger than we are, and its judgment more severe than we can handle. So God sends his son, Jesus, to take the punishment, remove the impediment, open the way for you to go to the Father. You call on his name and you're saved. You look to him and he forgives you. If you can do that this morning, then you can find a God that has been thinking about you for quite some time, taking you through whatever he has to bring you to the point where you'll surrender to him. And going forward, you're going to serve a God whose thoughts towards you, now that he has brought you to himself, is how he might bless you all the more and lead you and guide you and be with you. You're always on his mind. May you receive him today. And to those of you who know him well, be reminded again. Remind yourself. Let your mind travel again to the truths of God. Because when you do, you'll find him looking your way. You're always on his mind. Praise the Lord for that in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you guys. Great to be with you this morning.